Title sequence. Image of the Earth rotating in outer space. Title: Leadership is the key to inclusive employment. Webinar recording, 4 December 2023. Logo of the Global Leadership Exchange.
So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for making the time to join us for our event, Leadership is the Key to Inclusive Employment. My name is Blackmore. I'm the Emerging Leaders Coordinator with the now called Global Leadership Exchange, formerly known as the International Initiative for Mental Health Leadership and the International Initiative for Disability Leadership. We have a wonderful agenda today. Before I start outlining that for you, I have some acknowledgements that I would like to start our time together with. So I'm coming to you from Burraloo on the lands of the Whadjuk people, which you might know more familiarly as Perth in Western Australia. And I want to acknowledge that this land has belonged to and was taken care of and nurtured the Whadjuk people for many, many, many thousands of years before colonization. And I want to acknowledge that ongoing connection to land, sea, sky, and story. We're also joined by our New Zealand colleagues from Aotearoa. And I want to extend that same acknowledgement to the Maori people of Aotearoa and acknowledge their ongoing connection and ongoing custodianship. So I extend that same acknowledgement, respect, and welcome to all First Nations people, wherever you're joining us from today, and to all First Nations people joining us on the call today. Thank you for being here. And if you'd like to share the acknowledgement of where you're coming from when you start your presentation, we welcome that as well. I also want to acknowledge that many of the people joining us today and many of our speakers are working from their own lived experience and the strength and resilience that it takes to share lived experience for the benefit of others and for the improvement of systems. So I welcome and value and respect and honour all of those joining us from their lived experience today. This agenda would not have been possible without the support of the Disability Australian Reference Group, who has been stewarding and nurturing the work of IDL in Australia since about 2019, I think. So I wanted to upfront say a huge thank you to all of the members of the Australian Reference Group who helped design the agenda, the flow, choose speakers, and think about how we make this a really wonderful event for everyone. Thank you so much. Many of you have been part of the IMHL or IDL community for some time, and welcome back. And if you're new, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us. I wanted to outline a bit of the rules of engagement if this is your first time in this space. We create a really safe and unique space where we're all brought together by shared values and a shared commitment to creating a world where everyone can thrive and belong. And we have really interesting and deep and brave conversations in this space. So to help us do that, we like to make sure that we operate from some shared assumptions. So one of those assumptions is that we're inclusive of everyone. We welcome people at all leadership stages, people of all experiences, and people of all identities. We work from a principle of charity. That's one of our second rules of engagement. So we assume if people say something that they're actually operating from their best self. One of the easy examples of this is we work across many countries and language is different. So some places prefer identity first language, some places prefer person first language. And we assume that everyone who's sharing is working from the best language and the best values as they're sharing. And finally, our third rule of engagement is around respectful dialogue. So questions and points of view are welcome, but it's through dialogue. It's through that shared sharing to get to a better outcome together. And so we always listen to understand rather than listening to respond. I briefly covered the accessibility measures. So we have captioning available. It is automated captioning through Zoom, and our chat is turned off. So please, everyone's very good at this practice now, but please do keep muted unless you're speaking, and use the hands up feature if there are any questions that you would like to raise. Finally, we have a very quick survey at the end of this event. We really value your feedback. It helps us to improve our practice each time. So would appreciate you taking the time to respond to that survey at the end of this webinar. Speaking of, we are starting our hour with stories of impact from speakers who have been involved with different aspects of the International Initiative for Mental Health Leadership and International Initiative for Disability Leadership. Global Leadership Exchange is our new name. And so they're going to give you some quick, snappy stories about what does it mean to get involved? What does it feel like? And so what? What happens as a result? After those stories of impact, we'll actually go into breakout rooms, and each of you will have the opportunity to choose which breakout room you would like to go into and have more discussions in a smaller group space about that topic that was presented. If you need any help, I'll be on hand to help you get to the breakout room that you'd like to go to. We'll have a 5-minute break, and there'll be a countdown timer with an alarm to remind you to come back. Because we're across so many time zones, we just find the 5-minute timer on the screen with the audible alarm helps to get everyone back at the right time. After our break, we're very excited to have Donna Purcell present her research, and we've got a really good chunk of time aside for Donna's presentation, looking into how we can improve leadership attitudes to really get great careers for people with disabilities. We have a Q&A session after that, and then some updates from the Global Leadership Exchange, and finally a really exciting insight into all of the work and planning that is happening for the upcoming Leadership Exchange in the Netherlands in June 2024. So with that, I'd love to start off our stories of impact by introducing our first speaker. The only other thing, you may hear a couple of beeps towards the end of some of our speakers. That's just the timing reminder for them. So if you hear a beep, don't worry, it's only for the speaker who's sharing. So let me introduce you to Jan Kruger. Jan is the Executive Director and co-founder of Imagine More, and she's mum to Jack. She's going to be sharing her experiences around previous employment matches and taking those match lessons forward over successive leadership exchanges and into organisational work. So Jan, welcome.
Thank you very much. And thanks for having me and inviting me to share my experience. I'm, yes, Jack to mum, but I'm also the Executive Director of Imagine More here in Canberra. And Imagine More is part of a national alliance of capacity building organisations. And we're very much engaged in the employment space. So naturally, casting my memory back to pre-2019, when I did my first exchange on focusing on employment, we were sort of grappling with how we could be supporting families more around them seeking out sort of meaningful employment for their family member with disability, in particular focusing on people with intellectual disability and autism. The current system, employment services, just were not looking after people in the way that we were hoping for. So I did an exchange with Tash in Washington, DC, with Ruby Moore and Cecily Colson. They were great people to connect with, and just hearing all about their systems change over there, which I didn't know whether that was going to be the approach that we take in Australia, but it was really interesting to hear about how they went about it in the US. But also hearing about how they were working with schools. In particular, that was a focus for us here in Australia, to how we get schools more on board with finding meaningful work experience for students that can then lead to a career for them. Yeah, so it was really great to sort of connect with the other people and participants in the room as well. They came from all around the world. A lot of them were coming from a service perspective, so we were sort of coming from that family-led perspective, so that was slightly different. But then after that, we kept connected with a lot of the people that we met, in particular Ruby and Cecily, which then sort of informed what our focus might be when we applied for and were successful in getting a grant focusing on school to work with CRU in Queensland and family advocacy in New South Wales. And we then honed our learning around customised employment, because that was the key part of what they did in TASH, was focusing on a customised employment approach. So we've then gone ahead and done a lot more learning around that, and have been working with a lot of families around understanding what customised employment looks like, developing a lot of resources that are sort of helping families navigate their way while they wait for the service system to sort of catch up. We still do that systemic advocacy to help improve the service system so they can be walking alongside young people to get meaningful employment, but that's a work in progress. And then we did another virtual exchange in 2021, and that's where I shared a personal story of my son, Jack, and how we've applied customised employment in helping him find meaningful work. He's 21 now, he's working every afternoon, he's volunteering, and he's studying at CIT. And that's been through the efforts of our family. But we know that not all families have capacity to do this, and to have that service system really skilled up to do this nuanced work is sort of where we're hoping to land. So after that exchange, we've continued to have those relationships with the organisations globally, which has been really important, not just here in Australia, but also connecting with our New Zealand counterparts. So it's been really powerful to be part of that global network, and meeting new people and getting new ideas, and then adapting that to sort of work for the Australian context. So, I've got some resources I can share in the breakout room if people are interested. But we're really keen to just continue this work in upskilling families. So it's sort of like family leadership for employment, but also really keen to work with service systems that are wanting to implement a customised employment approach. So I don't know how much time I've got left, Ainsley, but that's sort of a snapshot.
Fantastic work. You're ahead of time. And thank you so much, Jan, for sharing your reflections and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let me move now to introducing Luke Mansfield. Luke is the Group Manager Disability Strategy within the Australian Department of Social Services. Luke was at one of our most recent meetings in Washington, DC, working with other government colleagues on workforce and employment policy innovation. So Luke, over to you. You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, thank you very much. Fantastic to be with you today. I'm joining from Ngunnawal country here in the ACT, and it's great also to hear Jan's reflections on her exchange, and maybe we'll need to connect later. So as Aisling said, in May 23, I had the pleasure of joining government officials from the US, UK, New Zealand, Canada, and fellow colleagues from Australia who all have responsibility for disability policy issues to discuss quite a different range of topics. But one of the key focal points for the meeting was a presentation from the US on their national approaches to the critical challenge of meeting disability workforce requirements. We selected this topic together as a group a few months earlier as something that all countries felt there would be a benefit in talking about, because every country had reflected that they were experiencing challenges in addressing workforce shortages in the delivery of care and supports to people with disability. I learned an awful amount from the US's presentation, both in terms of the things that were similar about our challenges, but also the areas of difference as well. Just to very briefly touch on some of the things that they were discussing, the US faces significant care workforce shortages with about 4.6 million workers now and an additional 1.3 million workers required by 2029, which is more jobs required than any other sector in their economy and exceeds the available working aged adults. They talked about the challenges in terms of turnover within the care workforce. I guess one thing that I was a bit surprised about is how substantial the reliance is in the US on informal supports. I think something like 80% of care being delivered that way, which I guess contrasts a little bit in terms of the direction in Australia, where there's been a fairly significant shift with the introduction of the NDIS. But in the US, formal direct personal care is growing, particularly community-based care following deinstitutionalisation. But there's an uneven spread across the country, and there's a combination of federal and state funding as well as insurance and private funds. One thing that was interesting was that past efforts to address their care workforce needs have focused on individual programs or sub-segments of the sector, but this time the US government has been taking a more systematic approach to addressing shortages, underpinned by a presidential executive order that directs resources and establishes a whole range of measures. So some of the things that they were focusing on were around how to make childcare and long-term care more accessible and affordable for families, how to improve access to home-based care for veterans, looking at enhanced job quality for long-term care workers, support for family caregivers, boosting job quality for early educators, and engagement with affected communities. They've got a whole strategy that they've developed around supporting family caregivers, which is really interesting, and a very strong focus on these issues across many different agencies within the government system. While we were there, we also had a separate session in the margins around improving disability employment outcomes, and this involved both government officials and non-government officials from the US. And key things that we talked about, similar to the discussion and reflections that Jan had, were around issues around job carving or customised employment, designing jobs around people and their strengths rather than the other way around, and the value and importance of individualised support, and a bit of a discussion around the individualised placement support model specifically. For me, there's huge value in sharing experiences across international borders. It helps officials like me and others joining today to think more broadly about the opportunity to learn from others and to adopt different ideas, but then adapt them to the Australian context. After the event, we've gone back and had discussions within Australia about what we're progressing here and what we can learn from some aspects of what's happening in the US, but also other countries overseas. And we're continuing to connect with those same officials globally, looking at other issues and topics. And for example, we're seeking to set up a meeting shortly with the UK around all things autism, including in the context of how they support people with learning disabilities and autism into employment. So they're the main things about the exchange. But can I just check how much longer I've got? Because I can talk a bit about Australia, or I can leave that to the breakout session.
You can have another minute. Is that enough time, Luke, or do you want to save it?
I'll probably save most of it, just to say that in terms of what's happening in Australia, there's a whole range of things that have been going on around workforce. The main thing is the release of a draft National Care and Support Economy Strategy in May this year, which focuses on quality care and support, decent jobs, and building a productive and sustainable sector. In October this year, Prime Minister and Cabinet published a summary of what was heard, which showed strong support for those 3 goals, and they're now in the process of updating that to focus on quality jobs in care and support, person-centred care, specific needs of First Nations people, and strengthening systems and responding to diversity of people across communities in Australia. On employment, I think the areas of focus really is around establishing a centre of excellence to improve employment outcomes. There is a new 18-month pilot with the Business Council of Australia and some very large employers to look at how we can tackle the barriers to career advancement of employees with disability, and really focus on how to drive change from job design through to recruitment, and move from entry-level jobs through to executive-level roles. So I might just leave it there. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Luke. And finally, there's me. So Ashlyn Blackmore, and I'm talking about our emerging leaders work and really bringing that frame around the idea of making steady progress. And I'd love to share a particular meeting that we hosted around disability leaders in the public sector across Europe. So how do we make sure that disability leaders are coming in and able to build careers, whether they're in government or in not-for-profit and community organisations? So my interest in this work particularly stemmed from, I have been involved with the Global Leadership Exchange since around 2017. Part of what made me curious about this work was I had started my connection with the disability sector in public service, and I recognised that I was working with deeply knowledgeable, deeply experienced people, but I wasn't sure how to build that same knowledge in myself. Being 20-something, very committed, and really wanting to strive to be the best that I possibly could, but really not knowing where to turn to start to develop a greater knowledge base to keep extending beyond what I was already doing within my workplace. The other thing that I was sort of bringing to the piece of the puzzle was I had come from a background of building youth leadership and youth decision-making structures, but in a slightly different context. And so I was familiar with some of the highs and lows that we get whenever we're trying to think about particularly bringing younger people into decision-making spaces. And that was relevant for the emerging leaders work because around that 2017 time, we started to build this recognition that we were missing some key people and voices from our spaces within the Global Leadership Exchange, particularly lived experience leaders, younger leaders, and leaders who were newer to the sector. So we had this great commitment and values base, all of this deep knowledge in the room. But there was sort of a question mark about how do we make sure that this is still coming back into the sector and being fed back in. So since then, we've been actively looking at how we create the conditions within our organisation to make sure that it is welcoming and that it is inclusive. But we also look to find the topics that are of interest and that are priority for those groups and aligning with those. And so as we've created the Emerging Leaders Network and strategy and model within the Global Leadership Exchange, we acknowledge there's a role for emerging leaders, for established leaders, for organisations, and for ourselves as an international organisation in linking, connecting people. But our model is also predicated on dialogue. So we work very much to create spaces where there's intergenerational collaboration. There's no sort of one-way street. It's always creating that space for a two-way dialogue and for mutual learning, reciprocal learning. So that was some of the pre kind of conditions that led into what happened at our meeting, which was a webinar called Beyond Accessibility, Building Leaders with Disability in Government and Public Sector Roles, We delivered this webinar in the middle of 2023 in partnership with the Swedish Agency for Participation. And we had a particular focus on Europe because the EU disability strategy has a particular focus on governments leading by example. And we really wanted to highlight best practice and great ideas, but also look at what are the things that create a bit of friction, and what are the areas that we could particularly benefit from paying attention to. So we had a full lived experience panel. All of our speakers had some kind of lived experience, and we brought a really good mix of different kinds of experiences of disability. We had parliamentarians, heads of government departments, board members, board chairs, all kinds of different perspectives, but from the very senior levels. And we were really lucky that people reflected on their careers, about how they learned, about how they navigated the systems. And they talked about quite winding roads to senior roles. They talked about some challenges, but they also talked about the great experiences they had, the benefits and the improved outcomes that they were seeing in government and for people with disability as a result of them being there at the decision-making table, at the agenda-setting table, not just sort of in an advisory role, but actively participating in that leadership. So as a result of that meeting, we have a report which goes through a few key headings. It's very short, only 3 pages. But we talk about how established leaders can destigmatize difference, how emerging leaders can work on their kind of readiness, but often it's sort of just by jumping in, you can only get ready for so long. There's a section on practical allyship, policy environment and practical changes for organisations, and an identification of some systemic reforms. More than that, there was also the emotional outcomes. We've got a very tangible outcome in the report, but we've had speakers and attendees who, since attending that webinar, talk about feeling more connected, feeling less alone, because that was a theme as well. There might be one kind of exceptional person who gets into this role, but it feels very isolating. And so being in that space of this webinar helped people see there are many other people making these steps towards this outcome and this mission within the world. And that work continues in the form of some of our Emerging Leaders Collaborative and other initiatives that we're happy to share later in the webinar. So to summarise, this is sort of an ongoing piece of work, but this particular meeting was one we're really proud of in the context of those really tangible outcomes and such an important topic, and links really beautifully to our discussions today. So speaking of discussions, let's move into our breakout rooms. I'm going to open those up now. You have 20 minutes in your breakout rooms. If you need any help at all, please just let me know. So welcome back to the second half of our webinar. I'd like to hand over to Luke Mansfield now, who will introduce Donna Purcell, our feature presentation speaker.
Thanks very much. So it's really my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Donna Purcell. Donna is a disability advocate known to many for her work in developing and leading change for greater inclusion of people with disability in Australia. She's a member of the senior leadership team at the National Disability Insurance Agency and a director on the board of Australian Network on Disability. As a person with lived experience, she's passionate about creating accessible and inclusive communities where people are supported to be their best. Donna has qualifications in management, human resources, and accessibility and inclusion, and is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and has represented Australia at an international and domestic level, and is actively involved in the disability community. Today, she will share her insights from her Churchill Fellowship project, studying leadership models that remove barriers to employment of people with disability. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Donna to present her work. I'm just checking that Donna is with us. Oops.
Mute. Currently unmuted. Hold play
Can you
button.
hear me, Lou?
Yes, we can hear you now, Donna, and I can confirm that the slides are presenting up on the screen. The first slide, overview slide, is up on screen now.
Thank you. So, firstly, thank you for the invitation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm on today in Mount Ku-ring-gai, the Ku-ring-gai people, and to also extend a welcome to all First Nations people and people with disability who are in this meeting today. So I guess just a little bit more about me. So before the role that I'm in at the National Disability Insurance Scheme, I worked in an access and inclusion role at Commonwealth Bank. And I was there for around 10 years or so, sort of, and grappling with, I guess, making sure that the banking sector was more accessible for customers and staff with disability. And it was while I was doing that role, I undertook two separate secondments at the Australian Human Rights Commission. The first one was in 2016, and that was working on a national inquiry into employment discrimination, specifically looking at older Australians, but also importantly, people with disability. So that was in 2016, and then not a lot happened from that inquiry. The second time I was invited back was during 2020, where I was invited by the then Disability Commissioner, Dr. Ben Gauntlet, to go back and lead or develop a project into employment for Australians living with disability. And while it was a great project, and eventually the project I developed, Includability, finally got launched post-pandemic, I think in September 21. It really just saddened me that I was there back invited to work on another project for employment for people with disability, and in Australia our unemployment rates were really just not changing, and so I was also deeply worried at the time that the pandemic was going to actually have an even greater impact on loss of jobs, or people with disability actually being able to gain jobs. So, and I guess part of triggering sort of this was just that unemployment rate or underemployment rate, sort of also not having changed for around 30 or so years in Australia. And I'm sure this is a stat that most of you are familiar with, but in Australia, people with disability are around 30% under or unemployed compared to the community of people without disability. And often those who do have disability who are in jobs are still more likely to be underemployed and to be working in part-time jobs when they really do want or have the capability of working in full-time jobs. So this was what really inspired me to do my Churchill Fellowship. And I thought if I could learn from some of the global leaders in countries or organisations that were doing well, I could bring some of that information back, and it might just help to change some of our jobs environment in Australia. And as Luke said, I have a disability myself. I have a vision impairment. I was born with a condition where now I've lost most of my useful vision, and I am a guide dog user. And that has really thrown a lot of challenges to me as a person with disability to build a career. And I'd almost say I'm an emerging leader. It's really only been since I joined the NDIA almost 3 years ago that it's my first senior leadership role. While I've got a lot of experience, it's really hard sometimes to break that barrier and to break down some of those assumptions around what people with disability can do. So our next slide, please. So where did I go? My travels took me to the UK, to the USA, to France and to Switzerland. I met with 22 organisations in all, including Microsoft. I went to their global head office in Seattle. I went to Nestlé in both France and Switzerland. I went to L'Oreal, HSBC, and that's just a snapshot of some of the corporate organisations I went to. In the government sector, I went to the UK Department of Work and Pensions, the UK National Health Service, and in New York, I met with the New York City Mayor's Office. I also went to some disability employment networks, including the International Labour Office's Global Business Disability Network in Geneva, and they were integral to helping connect me with a lot of the employers that I did visit. I'd gone to a conference there in 2019 and had stayed connected with them, and it is just that power of staying in touch in networks who through the ILO Business Disability Network, I was able to ask them to give me some introductions to a lot of the organisations who were their members that they identified as having good or leading practice. I also met with the Swiss Business Disability Network and the UK Business Disability Network in London. On top of that, I did also go to some disability organisations who were actually working with people with disability and placing people with disability and focusing around, in particular, training and job customisation. But I haven't included that in my talk today. But more than happy for people to connect out afterwards if that's something you would like some more detail. I have so much information, it was hard just to slot it into the context of covering everything today. So what did I learn? Firstly, I discovered that there were three key themes across most of the organisations that I did visit and that were having success in employing more people with disability. So if you'll pop to the next slide, please. So, so the three areas, the first was leadership. And I'm just going to just share a few tips on each of the three areas. So I found that there was mostly always a senior leader who had a close connection to disability and that they wanted to ensure that there was also opportunities to attract and support people with disability in their workplaces. Often this was because the leader had a child or children with disability themselves. And these leaders were also ensuring that there were other people with disability in senior roles. So not just employing people at entry-level roles or more junior roles, but that commitment to actually ensuring that there were people with disability in leadership roles and that they were, visible or known about, so that it was, I guess, demonstrating what they were committed to. And importantly, those people, those leaders, they were in a range of roles. Across organisations, but they also ensured that there were people with disability in some of those leadership roles who were leading the change in workplace inclusion and accessibility. And I think a couple of examples of that, or one in particular, that is probably well known, is Jenny Lay-Flurry, who works for Microsoft, and her role in being their Chief Accessibility Officer. My report has 10 recommendations in it, including some that are around leadership. So my first recommendation is really encouraging Australian organisations to encourage employers to introduce senior leadership roles, and one with that strategic approach around leading inclusion and accessibility within a workplace, and for both customers and for employing more people with disability and getting those workplace practices and the culture right. And an example of that is that Chief Accessibility Officer. And my recommendation 9 is about recommending that leaders in the public and private sector are proactively seeking and appointing leaders into management roles across a broad range of roles in an organisation. And it comes back to, I think, the career development, and I know that the project that was mentioned earlier, that has just kicked off in Australia, where with a few organisations there is that focus to not only bring people in for jobs, but that all important career development and making sure that careers are being built and that there are people being supported to actually move into leadership roles. I think in our Australian public sector, we also have a great opportunity to better use the affirmative measures practices that are available to us. It's something that is there to help increase the number of people in the public service, but I don't feel we use it often enough. So the second area is around building an inclusive and accessible workplace. And again, all of the organisations that were doing well and I guess had that senior leader in place, sometimes that CEO, was certainly making sure that it was not just being led from the top, but there was that inclusive practice and a commitment that moved across the whole organisation. And many of those leaders had actually made a commitment to the entire workplace and moving that change. A lot of them had connected up and made that commitment very public through the valuable 500, which runs out of the UK. And there was a really strong commitment to access and inclusion. And the commitment meant that it was allowing people with disability to apply for jobs with opportunities like recruitment where that was fully accessible, and where processes had been adapted to remove some of the barriers. And it was also about having the right support and adjustments to do their job and having opportunities to work in an inclusive and disability-aware workplace. So some of the examples included things like early access to workplace adjustments and removing some of those barriers at the recruitment stage, allowing people to fully participate in the selection process. And part of that was also around clear communication prior to the interview. So workplace adjustments were actually set up prior to an interview, allowing candidates to have whatever support they needed. So whether that was an Auslan interpreter or having access to questions before an interview, or actually even having the interview style changed to meet individual needs. So some employers, including Microsoft, had developed a recruitment process that was specifically tailored to meet the needs of applicants who were neurodivergent. And this allowed standard recruitment processes to be tailored to meet the needs of individuals rather than that one version of employment fits everyone. And that was removing some of the traditional processes that present barriers that often trigger unnecessary anxiety, like having to go through a very rigid interview process. So some of the things that they did was looking at prior to interviews, allowing candidates to meet the interviewer, or also running some pre-employment workshops where there was an opportunity to meet some of the staff in the organisation, to visit the organisation and to understand a little bit more about how the organisation worked. And going through that process, it took away a lot of the anxiety before the actual conversation around the job happened. Some other practical approaches also included having centralised approaches to workplace adjustments, and that included a centralised budget. So often I know in organisations there's, if it is being managed by a line manager, there's not that consistency either in decisions being made around workplace adjustments. So by having it centrally managed, it took away a lot of the decision making, whether it was around a budget or just a manager not quite understanding the need for an adjustment, and making sure that there was a team of experts who were supporting those, and almost going in with that response of, well, if you need this, sort of, yes, we will provide that. Whereas I know a lot of organisations, sort of, there's almost that justification behind needing to provide adjustments. So it removed all of that process and streamlined it. Also, and I know a lot of organisations do have this, the value of having disability employee networks, and how they were a network for connecting employees with disability, but also importantly growing affinity groups out of that, where there was some more target or specialised affinity groups, where there was that self-help or where there was a focus on particular disabilities, or also particular needs, like it might be around an assistive technology users group, for example, or around supporting other employees who are neurodivergent. Also, widespread disability awareness training was another common element among many of the organisations. So not just the basic disability awareness training, but also specialising in that training for leaders, making sure that leaders knew what they needed to do to actually support and set up employees with disability for success, and to make sure that there was that broader knowledge around being a leader and working with people with disability. And part of that training, I think, importantly, was also that a lot of that leader training was being delivered by people with lived experience of disability. And there was great value in getting staff with disability within these organisations, either delivering the training or certainly being involved in the co-design of what went into that training to make sure that it was actually truly representing people with disability. And some other examples, just one example of organisations who was doing really well was HSBC in the UK. So they had done a lot of work in both raising awareness within their workforce, but also a particular program that they were piloting was being led or sponsored by the CEO, who had 4 children with learning disability himself. And he thought, that his children, once they grew up, how would they ever get to work in a corporate environment like HSBC? And it triggered him to think about, well, how could people who may not fit that standard corporate, job description and be able to apply for vacancies, how could people with a learning disability actually still have a meaningful role within HSBC or other similar organisations? So the pilot started to look at where there were gaps and where there was a need within their customer service area. And the pilot was running to introduce meet and greet coordinator roles to work alongside the concierge team. And so when people went in, sort of to the concierge and went through security, they were then met by a meet and greet coordinator who was a person with disability, who would then escort them to the particular part of the organisation that they were going to for a corporate meeting, or if that's one example of where it was being used. And I got to go to Birmingham and meet up with the 5 young people who were in this pilot, and just sitting for the morning and listening to their stories and the impact of how having a job in that corporate setting, something that they had never dreamed of, and how that all came together. And so HSBC really designed the program. They worked with the families, they worked with the young people with disability and with a disability employment provider to make sure that they planned the program well and provided the right training, the right internal awareness in the organisation, and to get that all happening. And yeah, it's still running. I think they finished the pilot, and it's and it is now moved into that mainstream employment realm, and it's something that they're looking at introducing into the other offices outside of Birmingham. And I guess there were quite a number of jobs that I looked at in New York, in particular, that were looking at that customization model as well. And there is a lot more information in my report, in particular in New York, and a hospital that I visited called Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx. And I spent a couple of days visiting a lot of the programs there. It is something I would suggest is worth having a much deeper look at in my report. So the third area and the last one is that looking at measurement of disability in organisations. I think there's a big need to really look at how we're measuring and tracking and monitoring the change that is coming out of those programs. It's not important just to commit to that workplace inclusion within an organisation, but also imperative to know that the change that you are making is being monitored and reported on. And pretty much all of the organisations that I went to, were actually tracking that change. Some, it was because the government had imposed that, like in France, for example. But that was more around applying quotas, and a lot of those roles were entry-level roles, as opposed to organisations genuinely making that commitment to have jobs across all levels. There were 2 employers in particular in the UK sector that, or in the UK, that were really leading some of the tracking and monitoring. The Department of Work and Pensions and the National Health Service. So at the Department of Work and Pensions, they'd established programs including the Disability Confidence Scheme, and that was supporting both themselves and other employers to really build that workplace confidence and the capability to run inclusion programs. And a big part of that was then around looking at how it was actually going to be measured. There were 3 levels of the program, allowing employers to build their workplace inclusion and accessibility. And then many of the organisations that I met with had completed or were working through those levels of the scheme to actually build that disability confidence. And part of the program helped employers to understand that once they'd actually made that commitment to employing more people with disability, that there was then that need to monitor and report on the progress to make sure that the change that they were intending to do was actually happening. And if you don't do that, I guess, how do you know that you're actually making the change that you're planning to do? And the National Health Service in 2019 introduced the Workplace Disability Equality Standard. And this equality standard is a set of specific measures or metrics that allows the NHS to compare the workplace and career experience of all of their staff with disability to those without disability. The NHS organisations, so not just the NHS, it's hard to say itself, but all of the affiliated organisations were using this, and using a year-on-year comparison. It allowed them to compare that progress against the measures for equality. And it not only allowed, I guess, the organisations to track the progress, but to also continually look at where there was improvement needed, and where there were gaps, and where there was more needed work in particular areas that were being identified through those reports. And because the NHS is one of the largest employers in the UK, it was really having a big impact on the community, and people with disability really gaining that opportunity for meaningful employment. And for those staff who were already working there, I guess it was removing a lot of the discrimination, and that was what brought that program around in the first place. Was a lot of workplace discrimination was being identified, hence why the program started off initially looking at the equality of their workforce, but then expanded out to make sure that it was something that was being looked at more broadly across all of the organisations connected in through that NHS connection workforce.
Sorry, Donna, can I give you a 1 minute warning, and then we'll move into Q&A.
Perfect timing. So what can you do? So my last slide. So I think we all have an opportunity to lead change in our workplaces and the broader community. And I've already heard this morning that there's certainly a lot of people here doing that. We need to be the change makers. And I strongly urge you to look at what you can do and what change you can influence within your own workplaces and I guess the communities that you work within. And in closing, look, today has really just provided a high-level snapshot of what is included in my almost 200-page report. So there are 10 recommendations in all, some specifically for our Australian government. However, most are relevant to all employers or all communities. And I do encourage you to have a look at the report, but also please feel free to share it. And the next slide has my details and where you can find the report, but also I'm more than happy for people to reach out afterwards and connect if there's any further information I can provide. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna, for sharing your work with the group. It's fantastic to hear about it, but also, you know, having read the report, you know, it's very practically focused, and you've given, I think, governments and communities and leaders and all of us really some practical ways that we can together work to improve employment outcomes for people with disability, and really to leverage the massive benefits that come from having an inclusive workplace both for the workplace itself, but for the outcomes that are achieved in government and society and in business and in community settings as well. So thank you very much for sharing for today. We'll now go into a question and answer session. So if people can stick their hand up if you'd like to ask a question, and I will come to you. Hand up, or if you want to submit to the chat as well, and we will read it out.
We did have a pre-submitted question, Luke, which was asking about any tips for remote employer capacity building when working primarily in a small business context.
Thank you. There was one organisation that I met with in France, which had set up a cafe network, and in that case, it was something that it could apply to anywhere really. I mean, a lot of the cafes that had been established were there. I went to one in Paris, but I know that they'd set some up in regional settings as well, and it was an organisation called Cafe Joye. And they had up to, when I met with them, I think they were up to around 15 cafes that they had established. And it was a model that was looking at training people with disability in all aspects of working in a cafe. So I know it's something, we've come across here in Australia where there's people who work in the customer service side or maybe supporting in the kitchen with disability. But this entire business model was self-sustaining. So it was people working, as I said, being trained to work in all aspects of the cafe, but they'd also set it up as a way where it was online, was selling coffee beans to the corporate sector, and the sales from selling coffee beans, which was through a partnership with Nestle, was then putting money back into where the training happened as well. So it was a social enterprise model set up initially, by a philanthropic funder, and it is now an ongoing and sustainable business. I did hear that there was going to be, it was going to be introduced to Australia. I don't think it's happened yet. It's grown out and moved into the US at this stage. But certainly that is not just, the cafe, but I think just that particular model of setting up a sustainable business could be something that could fit in any area, remote, sort of, or more built up area.
Thanks, Donna. We might go to one more question, which is whether you've got any reflections on supporting youth in their first steps to employment. And then after that, I'll just give some reflections around some of the things happening in the Australian government. But youth in first steps towards employment, did you touch on that?
Thank you. Look, I think that one of the programs where I saw that support, particularly of youth, was in New York, and it was where there were some organisations, ICD and AHRC, who were doing some really great work in supporting for the last couple of years of school for young people with disability. Almost their last year or two of school was done in a workplace setting, and that was a hospital that I visited in the Bronx, Montefiore Hospital, and also through an institute, a university that was also in the Bronx, that was also training people, training people to actually work in that educational setting. And yeah, there was, I guess, a lot of support to finish part of the school curriculum, but to do it in a learning environment within the workplace and at the same time learning a particular job. So with the hospital setting, young people were put on almost like a rotating program where there were several jobs in about 6 or 8 areas of the hospital that they would come in and they would try out jobs, and they do that for a couple of months and then move on to another area. And it was a way of training, finishing that education, but also giving that opportunity to try out different work in different areas, a little bit like a graduate program would happen here in Australia. And then once it was identified, the actual role and the type of setting that was going to best meet that school leavers, career opportunities and what they genuinely wanted to do, that was generally where they moved into an ongoing placement. So that was a program that was running really well, and and as I said, was targeted specifically for kids in their last 1 or 2 years of school.
Thank you very much. I think that there's one more question. I'm conscious that we're almost out of time, but I think Jan has a question. So I'll go to Jan and then we'll wrap up this session.
Yeah, thanks, Donna. That was a great presentation. It'd be good to catch up afterwards now that we're running out of time. But I was just intrigued if you met up with some of the other organisations over there that were focusing on customised employment. So not so much a program, but like just that one person at a time approach.
Answer to that is yes. I met with an organisation called Job Path, and that was pretty much all they did was focused on customised employment, individual by individual. And I met with their office in New York City, but they had offices, right throughout the US. But I'm more than happy to catch up offline, and if it's something beneficial, connect you to them as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Like just to understand sort of how much training and mentoring sort of is offered to their staff. That's what I'd be really interested in. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So on behalf of everyone who has joined today, can I please thank Donna Purcell for your time and for sharing your experiences. I definitely commend to everyone to have a good look at Donna's full report and to think about, as Donna suggested, how you can be a change maker in driving disability employment outcomes in your own context. Before I hand back, I just thought I would very briefly talk about the Disability Royal Commission and the next steps around that, just because it did have a very strong focus on employment. Some of the areas, very briefly, that it touched on went to accessible information and communication, removing barriers to employment, transition points from school to employment, reform of the DES program, looking at opportunities for driving people with disability employment outcomes in the public sector, leveraging the procurement power of governments to encourage inclusive employment practices in the private sector, and looking at pay levels of people working in Australian disability enterprises or supported employment. The government all governments are currently considering the recommendations in the final report very carefully, and there's been a commencement of a consultation process to draw out views around particular recommendations from individuals and families and communities and organisations that you can find on the DSS Engage webpage if you want to Google that. And you can also provide a submission if you wish to, and the Australian government will be having a whole range of different roundtables and workshops and other things in the new year to work through some of the recommendations as advice is formed for government consideration next year. But I'm going to hand back now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, both Donna, for your deep dive presentation and Luke for ably chairing that session for us. I'm delighted now to introduce Barbara Disley. Barbara is our board chair for the Global Leadership Exchange. She's been a senior leader across public and non-government sectors, including serving as the chair of the first New Zealand Mental Health Commission, Deputy Secretary of the Ministry of Education and Chief Executive of Emerge Aotearoa. Barbara is giving us an update on the Global Leadership Exchange. Barbara, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, kia ora and tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to everybody from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and from Australia. I am Australian by birth, and I do often say that I choose to be in New Zealand, but I still have very close contacts on the other side, and have recently just been over there visiting my 94-year-old mum. So I feel like I'm a citizen of both places, really. And it's a great pleasure to be the chair of the Global Leadership Exchange and to be able to hear so much of the richness that comes when we share learnings, begin to listen to each other, learn from each other, and are open to taking fresh, new, and sometimes old ideas and building them forward and making them work in our place. I believe Sean, and I really want to acknowledge Sean because it's sort of, he started this session at 12 a.m. In the UK, and it's now 2 a.m. And so I hope he's still awake and sitting there ready to take over from me and talk about the next exchange. The few things that are on behalf of Steve, who is of course our chair, I did want to just talk about a little bit was, you know, what we are about. We are about connecting leaders, all leaders in mental health, disability and substance use, and creating space for the sharing of ideas, the questioning of ideas, sometimes even the challenging of ideas, so that we're all on that journey to do better than we can do. In our organisation, we are well supported in this process by a number of the governments across the world. So we've got Australia, Canada, England, Northern Ireland now, the Netherlands, Slovakia, just our newest organisation coming in, Sweden, the US, and Wales, along, of course, with New Zealand. So I feel really privileged that we're in that position where we've got all of these connections and tentacles and can bring together a sense of global connection, which is in my sort of experience even more important at the moment, that we connect as a global community and bring our wisdoms and our things that we share as humanity together, as opposed to exaggerating often our differences across cultures and continents. We are driven as an organisation by some key principles, and they are things that will resonate with, I'm sure, many of you: inclusiveness, competency, being authentic, working collaboratively, innovation, and being visionary and not afraid to be out the front, taking the next steps. So they're the sort of leadership principles that we see that sits within our organisation. One of the exciting things, and I don't know whether Aisling's going to talk a little bit about that, is that we are setting up a lived experience council. It will be chaired by Clinton Farquharson, who is from the UK and has been and is a very strong advocate for disabled people. Clinton is on our board. He does have living experience, and so he will be heading up the council, and that council will have 5 additional members. And we're particularly wanting to focus on getting people from underrepresented leadership groups like Indigenous leaders, emerging leaders, family leaders, youth and young people. And so that's coming up, and we will be looking at how we recruit, or we have looked at how we're going to recruit in there for those people to be able to strongly advise the board and all parts of our global group on how we can go forward better and more strongly. We also, and Aisling will talk about this, that we are an organisation that is trying to foster emerging leaders and in a way which is equitable, and as I said, gives that sense of equity and parity. And so there's a heap of principles that we want to drive through all our work, which keep us mindful, because we have to be mindful as a global entity of how we fulfill and model possibilities going forward. And not always easy, but it is certainly our intention and where we're headed. I'm really want to thank Aisling, Eddie, and Lorna Sullivan, who I noted was on here as well today, for the work that they've done over many years to ensure that the voice of members of our network that do have living experience of disability are represented at our tables at all levels. And we, as I say, are working to strengthen what and how we do things. And it's only by having strong participation at all levels that we get challenged on a regular basis to do things and to do them better and differently. And so kia kaha, we need to keep strong, we need to keep together, we need to keep challenging but responding to those challenges. So great to be here and to be part of this. And nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So back over to you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And as flagged, we're now going to introduce our colleague, Sean Russell. Sean is the European lead for the Global Leadership Exchange and our Chief Operating Officer designate. He's also the principal investigator of the mental health and productivity pilot across the Midlands Engine in the UK. He has a rich career history, including as the head of Thrive for West Midlands Combined Authority and many senior and distinguished roles at the West Midlands Police. Sean is here to give us an update as we look forward towards our Netherlands Leadership Exchange. Face to face, Sean, tell us all about it. We're so excited to all be together again.
Yeah, thank you, Aisling, and really appreciate this. Great to see you all this morning. And what an exciting time it is for us approaching, really. We are moving towards our Leadership Exchange, which is our flagship programme, which takes place every 18 months, and it will be taking place in the Netherlands in June 2024. The dates for your diary, if you haven't got them already, but I'm hoping most of you have already got them, it's the 24th to the 28th of June next year. We have launched it now. We're live on our website. As Barbara said, and Ashleen earlier on today, we've changed our name from IIMHL and IIDL to GLE. We've now got a really lovely website, which is where the original one was. So actually all of the highlights of that now are on our system, which is really easy and actually very accessible for people to demonstrate that. For people who haven't been to a leadership exchange before, our first 2 days are going to be matches that will take place either in Europe or in the Netherlands. So we've got some taking place in the UK, a couple taking place in Belgium, and a couple the rest of them will be taking place in the Netherlands. We have about 33 matches currently, of which 7 of them at the moment are disability focused, which is great to see. And a number of the others are actually jointly held. So actually we're trying to create the cross-fertilisation between mental health, disability and substance use, which is really fascinating for us to understand that translational element between all areas. Just as an interesting point, we've got quite a lot around disability leadership and co-production. It's something that's popped up quite a lot today in the discussion here. That's being led by TLAP, which is Think Local Act Personal in the UK. So Barbara, our chair, mentioned Clinton. He's also the chair of TLAP and works with Ian McCreef, so that'll be a really exciting opportunity. There's also quite a lot of work around supporting leaders and personalised within the frame of the UNCRDP, which I think will also be really, really exciting for people to understand actually how that is being driven. And then following on from the UNCRDP agenda, actually, we've got David Nuttall, who is the chair of our Global Leaders Advisory Group for Disability, and he's also the Deputy Director in the UK, in England, for disability. We'll be looking at the impact around leadership across government using the UNCRDP as a frame, which I think will be really fascinating for us as well. And we've got a number of others, and this is really just to shout out again to the wonderful leadership actually demonstrated by Ashleen, Lorna and Eddie, pushing this agenda, because actually the work around Equally Well, the work around local area coordination, self-direction, culture and change and emerging leaders are all areas that are being driven really from the centre, from the team in the middle, which is put this event on today. So it feels like that's going to be an amazing opportunity. On the Wednesday, we will have the welcome reception in Utrecht, which if people don't know the Netherlands very well, it's a little bit south of Amsterdam. It's about 20 minutes on the train. A beautiful old city with a lovely central clock that goes back to about the 10th century. So lots and lots of history. And it's surrounded by a 7-kilometre canal, which you can swim in, I'm told. I wouldn't advise it, but I'm told you can. So it's a lovely area. On the Thursday, Friday, we will have our leadership exchange, which will take the form of a network meeting. And we've got lots of meetings going on at the moment to make sure we have a very strong network programme that is mixture of mental health, disability and substance use, just to make sure we've got the blend effectively right. And actually, if you'll have been at the last number of leadership events, and I would say the last one in particular, both in Christchurch, Washington and Dublin, although they were held separately, there was a real commitment to ensuring that disability was at the fore of everything that we did. And I think that's something that we're really proud of now, that we're really pushing that agenda, and we're going to determine to keep that position. So we're working at the moment with the colleagues in the Netherlands, and poor old Ashleen and Eddie will have to be working a little bit later this evening, and I got the wrong end this morning, they've got the wrong end this evening, to actually connect with our colleagues in the Netherlands just to make sure we've got that connection right. It has been a little bit difficult because in the Netherlands, the disability network is slightly dispersed compared to where it is in other countries. So we have been starting from scratch, but some brilliant leadership by both Ashleen and Eddie behind the scenes to build a really strong connectivity point. So I've got a really good process now, I think, for the leadership exchange. It will be an amazing event. We are hoping that a number of people from our Southern Hemisphere colleagues are able to attend, both for the network meeting and also the matches. Unfortunately, I have to say that we will not be doing a hybrid event. So one of the things that we are very thoughtful of, it will be a completely in-person event. So the matches last year we did hybrid or virtual because of COVID fallout, but actually we've decided this year it will be totally in person. So apologies for that. So if you are going to come, I'd make sure you log on to the website now, book your slot nice and early, and then work through the process to do that. And accommodation is, we've booked quite a lot of accommodation in and around the Utrecht area, including a number of very good accessibility rooms as well, which myself and Kathy Langlois, the North American lead, and working with Eddie, have visited a number of those already. So it's very, very good and very positive. So it should be a very good inclusive event all round. So enough from me, Aisling. I'm going to pass back to you, and thank you for the opportunity this evening.
Thanks, Sean. Where do we go if we want to register?
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Our website now is www.gle, which is Global Leadership Exchange, but it's Golf Lima Echo GLE.world. It's got a really lovely website now, and on that website now we have got the details of the all of the matches, the Leadership Exchange, and how you register. And we would like you to become a member of GLE if you're not already. So anyone who's on the call today who'd like to be a member, it's free for participating government area organisations. So Aisling, thank you very much for the prompt, and you'll very kindly have placed it into the chat too.
Aisling, can I just jump in there and say, I meant to say that Steve has just been down here and visited both Aotearoa and Australia, and met with many of the leaders that many of you will know. And he just wanted me to remind people of that. So we know we're down at the bottom here, but we've got some fairly powerful voices within the Global Leaders Network who either sit down here or who do keep a very clear eye on what's happening. And I also wanted to acknowledge the work of Brian Coffey, who is the advisor at Waikaha, and he has been the past chair of the leadership network, so for disability. So, yep, thank you.
Thank you all so much. So everyone here, thank you for staying with us for our webinar. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Sean, for these updates about our Global Leadership Exchange and our upcoming signature event in the Leadership Exchange. We're really excited to be able to meet with people face-to-face in Europe. Some thank yous as we close out our time together. First of all, to all of our speakers, Jan, Luke, Donna, Barb, and Sean, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences and insights and wisdom with us, and taking the time to prepare. We really value your contributions and couldn't do it without you. Other people we couldn't have done this event without are our Australian reference group, and I actually do want to name our current and recent members. So Anne Scortis, Deb Roberts, Sarah Hansen, Jan Kruger, Mark Rogers, Mark Glaskadine, Belinda Wilson, Linda Blake, Marianne Diamond, Kath Viney, Lynn Young, Anita Davis and Luke Mansfield, and Lorna Sullivan, bringing our New Zealand connection. Thank you all so much. You've made this event far better than it could have been if we were just trying to do things on our own. So thank you for helping us set the agenda and make such a rich event. I want to give a special thank you to Eddie Bartnik, who so ably convenes our work across the disability spheres across the world in the background, and so ably brings together so many of these stakeholders across Australia. Thank you, Eddie, for being a huge support to all of us across double IMHL, double IDL, now the Global Leadership Exchange, and to Lorna Sullivan as well, who nurtures so many connections and so many matches and so many collaboratives. Thank you, Lorna, for all of your work and leadership. Finally, attendees, it wouldn't be a webinar without all of you. So thank you for giving us 2 hours of your time, whether it was very early in the morning or your afternoon. We welcome you, and we would love to have you stay in touch with us. So a couple of next steps. So one, there will be a recording and the attachments in terms of some of the resources we've talked about will be available. Given it's December, I'm going to give about 2 weeks, but it'll be in your inbox as a nice little Christmas present to revisit and re-experience all of these lovely events. And a bit of a call to action. We'd love to have you register for the Netherlands Leadership Exchange. We've got the link sitting in the chat. If that's not an option and you're not already a member, please sign up as a member. It is free for you to participate because we have country membership provided in Australia and New Zealand. And finally, please give us feedback. When I close the meeting, there will be a feedback poll. We always use that information to make these events better, more tailored, more focused on the topics that you want to explore and the speakers you want to hear from. So there's 3 calls to action. Please choose any, but a huge thank you from all of us to all of you, wishing you all the best for the day ahead.